It was the second Saturday of March when 26-year-old Wren Castellano stood at the rail of the Boone County Small Livestock Auction outside Columbia, Missouri, watching 11 English Angora rabbits nobody in the building wanted to bid on. They were a rough sight, their coats matted and wool-blind, thick fur grown so long and neglected it covered their eyes entirely, tangled with hay and burrs from what had clearly been months without proper grooming. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Delbert Fanning, had already run through the lot twice trying to find a single opening bid, since every serious buyer in that barn was there for meat rabbits, New Zealand whites and Californians with real carcass yield, not overgrown wool balls that would dress out to almost nothing once you accounted for how little actual meat sat under all that fiber. Wren raised her hand at $4 a head. The laughter that followed was quiet but unmistakable, the particular sound of people who already understood something and enjoyed watching someone about to learn it the hard way. Gary Hutchins, who ran the largest commercial meat rabbitry in that end of the county, leaned toward the man beside him and said something behind his hand that made the man's shoulders shake. Wren heard it. She had the particular stillness of a woman who'd spent the last 6 months hearing plenty of things people assumed she couldn't hear or didn't care whether she did. She was 26, slight, dark hair pulled back under a faded ball cap, wearing a second-hand flannel jacket 2 sizes too big, the kind of jacket you buy at a thrift store when you're rebuilding a life from close to nothing rather than replacing one piece at a time. 8 months earlier, she'd left a marriage that had quietly eaten most of her savings along with most of her confidence, moving back to 5 acres her grandmother had left her outside town, land with a small barn and no real plan attached to it yet. She'd found the Angora listing in a farm auction bulletin the week before, 11 rabbits from a hobby breeder who died that winter, his estate needing the animals gone fast and cheap since nobody in the family wanted to deal with matted, wool-blind rabbits that needed real grooming knowledge to even approach safely. Wren had spent that whole winter reading everything she could find about fiber animals, not out of any romantic notion about rabbits specifically, but because fiber was the only kind of livestock small enough, cheap enough, and quiet enough that she could realistically manage alone on 5 acres with almost no capital and a part-time job in town that didn't leave much daylight free. What she'd learned, reading late at night at her grandmother's kitchen table, was that English Angora wool, the exact kind buried under those matted, wool-blind coats everyone in that barn was laughing at, was almost entirely irrelevant to a meat rabbit's market value, and almost everything to a hand spinner's. Angora fiber ran finer and softer than most sheep's wool, prized by spinners and fiber artists specifically for its warmth-to-weight ratio and its halo, the fuzzy, glowing quality it took on once spun and worked into yarn. A meat rabbit breeder looked at those 11 animals and saw wasted feed cost on rabbits too wool-heavy to dress out efficiently. A fiber artist would look at the exact same rabbits and see pounds of premium raw material walking around on 4 legs, growing back every few months whether anyone harvested it or not. She paid her $4 6 times over, signed the paperwork with Delbert Fanning, and loaded 11 overgrown, matted rabbits into a borrowed dog crate stack in the back of her hatchback, while Gary Hutchins watched from near the exit, arms crossed. He caught her at the door on her way out. $4 a head for rabbits that'll cost you $20 a month in feed and give you nothing back, he said. You know that, right? Wool rabbits are a dead market. Nobody's spun their own yarn since their great-grandmother quit doing it out of necessity. I appreciate the concern, Gary, Wren said, and kept walking. Word moved through Boone County the way it always did. By the following week, at the feed store, the story of the Castellano girl paying real money for wool-blind, worthless rabbits had made its full circuit, arriving at the general conclusion that Wren was either naive about livestock or simply not thinking clearly. Understandable enough, people said, given everything she'd been through that year. She was neither. She spent that first month doing almost nothing but grooming, sitting on an overturned bucket in her grandmother's barn most evenings after work, working matted wool loose a section at a time with a slicker brush, and more patience than she'd known she had left in her since Angora coats, if you rushed the detangling, tore easily and damaged the very fiber that was supposed to be worth something. Have you ever taken on something everyone around you had already decided wasn't worth the effort, purely because you'd run the numbers yourself and come to a different answer? 3 of the 11 rabbits had matting bad enough that Wren had to shave them down completely that first month, rather than risk injuring them trying to save the coat, a real setback since shaved wool sold for considerably less than properly harvested full-length fiber. She recorded the loss plainly in the notebook she'd started keeping and kept working the other 8. She found real help in Opal Reyes, 68, a retired art teacher who ran a small hand-spinning guild out of her home 20 minutes away, a woman Wren found through a single flyer pinned to the bulletin board at the public library. Opal wasn't a rabbit person, she was a fiber person, and she taught Wren the actual mechanics of what made Angora wool valuable in the first place. The specific harvesting method, plucking loose wool during a rabbit's natural molt rather than shearing, which preserved the fiber's full length and value, how to sort fiber by grade, how to skirt out the coarser guard hairs that would ruin a fine-spun yarn if left mixed in. "You don't fight what the fiber wants to be," Opal told her, sitting at her spinning wheel that first visit, watching Wren's raw, unsorted wool with a critical eye. "You sort it honest, grade it honest, and the spinners will pay for honesty every time. What you don't do is try to sell them tangled mess and call it premium." By May, Wren had first harvested her first real batch, 4 ounces of properly graded, cleanly plucked English Angora fiber from her best recovered dough, and Opal helped her list it through the Guild's small online marketplace, a corner of the fiber arts world Wren had never known existed until that winter of reading. The first sale came within 3 days, $8 an ounce, to a spinner in Oregon who left a review calling it some of the finest raw Angora she'd handled in years. Wren read that review standing in her grandmother's kitchen and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since long before she'd ever bought a single rabbit. By August, she'd built a standing list of regular buyers, spinners and fiber artists across a dozen states who ordered every time she posted a new harvest, some asking specifically for fiber from certain does once they'd worked with it and liked the particular quality of that animal's coat. She'd started breeding selectively, keeping offspring from her best fiber producers rather than simply letting the herd multiply on its own, the same patient discipline Opal had modeled from the very first visit. Gary Hutchins drove out to her place that September, parking at the edge of her gravel drive and standing there a moment before he said anything. "Heard you're doing something with those rabbits," he said. "That's right," Wren said, walking over to the fence where 6 of her Angoras grazed in a small run. Coats full and clean now, nothing like the matted mess he'd watched her load into her hatchback that March. He was quiet, looking at the rabbits. "Told you it was a dead market," he said, finally. The particular discomfort of a man hearing his own words land differently than he'd meant them. "You told me nobody spun their own yarn since their great-grandmother quit doing it out of necessity. Turns out, plenty of people do it now, not out of necessity, because they want something a machine can't make. I've got buyers in 12 states who'd tell you the same thing if you asked them." He didn't have much to say to that. He drove off, and Wren went back to work sorting that week's harvest into grades the way Opal had taught her. Honest, unhurried, exactly the way fiber that mattered was supposed to be handled. By the following spring, Wren's herd had grown to 22 rabbits, her 5 acres finally paying for something real instead of simply sitting there as an inheritance she hadn't known what to do with. Opal still came by most weeks, sitting on the same overturned bucket Wren had started on, watching the herd with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd helped something recover that everyone else had already written off, and telling anyone who asked that Wren Castellano ran the finest small Angora operation in that whole part of Missouri, built entirely out of 11 rabbits nobody else in a crowded auction barn had thought were worth $4.